Everything has infinite dimensions. I don't really mean that in a scientific sense, where we currently exist in a three-dimensional space. At least that's our current paradigm. Rather, I mean dimension as a trait something has. For example, when you meet a person, you can assess them for their moral quality, which is a certain important dimension of behavior, their intelligence, happiness, or their class, sex, or racial type. For each, they are dimensions of their persona, which change how their lives work. In order to understand a person, you need to have a comprehensive understanding of how they can relate to their context. This is so complex as to be impossible to do perfectly, yet we have to do it all the time to survive in the world. I've been thinking more and more lately about why people don't notice what the natural endpoint of their actions are. This relates to Aristotle's concept of the telos, or that all things have a natural direction they flow towards without even thinking. For example, almost all things, even the inanimate like hurricanes, nations, or glaciers, will without even thinking try to expand themselves against other things, even if unconsciously. Governments will naturally try to extend their power, and the sexes will try to mate with the other. However, it always blows my mind when the consequences for an action are completely obvious, and yet people are dumbfounded by the result. The American government printed the most money of any era of history, and then we're shocked when we see inflation. The inflation should be way, way worse than what it is now. People eat unhealthy food and are shocked when they get fat. People spend their whole lives in sin and godlessness with no interaction with meaning, and then they're shocked when they feel unfulfilled. For years, I've struggled to learn what living a happy life truly means. You think it's empty words until you realize what it's like to not live with it. Most people I've known in my life have not been happy, and as a child, I vowed to construct my life in a way where I could be happy as an adult. This has been a harder journey than I could have imagined that I've asked the wisest people I know in my life. These are the people I respect, often very accomplished, like CEOs, politicians, artists, and thinkers. I ask them, how does one live a happy life today as a young man? The most blackpilling thing is that no one's really given me a good answer so far. This video is an endpoint of my search for this question. In order for us to be happy as a society and the individuals in that society, here are 12 assumptions we have to shatter as a culture. These are 12 ways that we see the world that is tearing us down to misery and hell in real time. This is a video, the soul of modern civilization. As you will see, I choose to shatter the glass and restart, since I see no other path where we survive both as a culture and as individuals. Our perception of the world is largely an illusion held together by biased media that intentionally obfuscates things to keep up the mirage. Thankfully, Ground News helps me get a clear view of the world. Ground News isn't a news outlet, it's an app and website that pulls in related coverage of thousands of news sources so that you can see the same story get covered across the political spectrum. Every story comes with a breakdown of each source's political bias and ownership so you can see how these factors affect how they frame the news. For example, let's dive into Texas's decision to remove over 1 million voters from its rolls. Ground News found more than 70 articles covering this with barely any reporting coming from leftist sources. Of the ones that are reporting on this, NBC is calling this move a chilling message, while The Independent seems to hint at voter suppression. However, on the right, the Epoch Times emphasizes Texas's removes non-citizens and deceased to prevent any fraud. I really love their blind spot feed, where you'll find more stories the left are covering, like California lawmakers passing a bill that could make undocumented immigrants eligible for home loans. News like this can really change the outcome of elections and trajectory of this country, but only if you're aware of them. I've been working for Ground News for years, and I actually do use them as a service in my life, and they've been a great company to work with. And go to ground.news/whatif or scan my QR code on screen to see what else the mainstream media isn't showing you. My viewers save 40% on the same plan I use for unlimited access to all their features. Not only would you be supporting my work, you'd also be supporting an independent platform that respects conservative views. For those who don't think our society is very sick in a profound way, I don't know what to tell you. You're either old enough to be removed from the main generative force of the society, or your head is buried 1,000 miles into the sand. I would say, what evidence would you need to see that our society is terminally sick on a spiritual basis? I mean, I could point to dozens of different things, between the skyrocketing deaths of despair, crippling mental health issues, depression, or loneliness. All of these are at the worst points ever in human history. I'm going to be more holistic, though. The democratically elected Western governments are trying to commit civilizational suicide. Many countries in Northern Europe are openly championing degrowth and deindustrialization as their dominant political agenda. Every major Western government is importing millions of immigrants against their own economic self-interest for the express purpose of replacing the local white population. Nearly 100% of new jobs in America since COVID and in the last few years have gone to immigrants. Diversity quotas have completely destroyed the West's economy, so much so that nearly all job openings in the top 500 companies for the last few years have gone to non-whites. Keep in mind, white people are around 75% of America's genetics, and the number is higher in Europe. So being anti-white is just being suicidal for the West. The entire West's cultural forms have been taken up by a church, which rationalizes every single facet of life into an inchoate nihilism, which only pushes for its own destruction. You can add this to the birth rate, which is at the lowest rate ever in history. The birth rate today is crashing almost everywhere in the world, faster than the fastest UN or government projections could have guessed. Keep in mind that these people and these statistics have really wide standard deviations, so what's going on now borders on the apocalyptic. This is the greatest crisis of our time, while at the same time something almost no leaders or regimes around the world take seriously. A quarter of Gen Z Americans think it's morally wrong to have children, and the numbers are even higher in Northern Europe. I've talked about all of these points in previous videos, in which the one I would like to recommend the most is my video on the psychological Black Death. However, what all of this underlies is that we are a profoundly psychologically or spiritually sick culture. The most that has ever existed that I can see so far ever in human history. Furthermore, this sickness is killing us very quickly. One of my favorite historians, Carroll Quigley, writing around 1960, when ranking the West's social institutions, said that the West's great weakness was its lack of religion. He said that if the West couldn't solve its failed religious issue, that no matter how wealthy or technologically advanced we were, we would see the rise of a cancerous anti-religion, which would destroy Western civilization. I'm so glad nothing like that's ever happened. One of the rules I have is that before I judge someone, I try to listen to what they're really saying, or often literally saying. This sounds profoundly stupid and simple, but almost no one actually does it. For example, modern Western women publicly state their complete contempt for men all the time. Just look at any media. The left publicly states their complete self-loathing of their own society and their heritage. This means they really loathe themselves. They believe this so strongly that they also literally state that they support civilizational suicide. Hamas literally says, "from the river to the sea." The Chinese Communist Party literally says it wants to recreate the old Chinese empire from the Qing dynasty. Iran literally calls America the Great Satan. Modernity has this very profound naivete, which I can't understand, but is probably our greatest weakness. We let the Marxists take over our institutions while they literally publicly said they want to destroy everything we love. The British and French appeased Nazi Germany when the Nazis also literally said they wanted to genocide Eastern Europe for their Lebensraum. This is one of the stupidest mistakes we make as a society. I partly blame social feminization. Dozens of scientific studies, as well as just the common wisdom, is that women are attracted to dark triad traits like Machiavellianism, sociopathy, and narcissism. The stereotype goes that women are attracted to bad boys who treat them terribly. Literally read any female romance novel or even ask women about the guys they've dated, and this is just obvious. Thus, it makes sense that a feminine society would have an unspoken, deep attraction for those who wished its ill and completely reject its values. You can call me a misogynist all you want, but am I actually wrong? I don't know why others can't see this since it's so ridiculously obvious to me. I just listen to what people say and then form an assessment from it. I see it on the right too, in which moderate conservatives will often work with radical rightists, where I tell them, you know, if those radicals win, they're going to put all of us in camps. So why are you trying to appease them? When I hear leftists or political radicals in general, I can see that they're in a tremendous amount of pain. Sure, there are always sociopaths in a population who will naturally like to predate off others, but they're less than 20 to 5% of the population naturally. When you see most political radicals, you're seeing a person whose soul has been so consumed and chewed up by the cruelty and dehumanization of the world. In order for the West to elect suicidal governments, our entire society must be in so much psychological pain as to make suicide seem like the good answer. That's how all suicides happen psychologically. If you read suicide notes, the common unifying thread is the word useless, where suicide occurs when people feel as if their lives have no natural meaning and they're not useful or needed by anyone. The absence of silence in our culture has always weirded me out. I was raised a Quaker or a sect of Christians who meditate in silence as a way to reach God. Silence is sacred in Quakerism, and this was an attitude I grew up with. Silence is very important to me and why I've stopped living in cities. The sacredness of silence is that it gives space for the mind to unwind, in which it can start to introspect. However, our civilization does every single thing it possibly could in order to avoid introspection. We constantly barrage ourselves with hedonism, stimuli, screens, excitement, ideology, buzzwords, amongst other things, in order to avoid ever thinking more deeply. It's even true on a macro level in which our academic, religious, and spiritual institutions avoid thinking about anything deep. You go to church and they don't talk about the spirit of God, rather its outward manifestations. I don't think they often even believe that there's an inner spirit of God. The philosophy our civilization propounds, or postmodernism, openly rejects any meaning or truth in the world. This reconciles our lives to a meaningless hell for our entire civilization. The insane thing is we don't ever talk about this. How come the sexes hate each other? People don't want to have children. Our civilization is committing suicide while people lack any meaning, but the philosophers and greatest minds of our people aren't actively trying to understand and combat this. Even conservatives don't take this seriously at all. In order for our society to survive, we need to take the souls of the people involved seriously. The question is, how do you fix a society dying of a spiritual or psychological plague? Well, the good thing is that I've developed the best answer I can. Part 2. Reprogramming. One of the things which complicates this equation is that human life doesn't fit into easy boxes. If you were to ask me whether or not you want to heal your soul, or you should target your material life, your religious beliefs, or use a therapist, I would reply with yes. One of the best recent books on psychology to come out is Lost Connections by Johann. The thesis of the book is that rather than being a chemical imbalance of the brain, depression is caused by your life actually being terrible, stemming either in some part from potential causes being loneliness, poverty, lack of meaning, beauty, and many other things. The fact that this is not completely obvious to our society blows my mind. Of course, someone's psychology is an outgrowth of their environment. This is something Charles Taylor talks about in his book, A Secular Age, which is really about comparing the medieval psychological view of the world to the modern. He said that in the pre-modern world, we viewed psychology as part of a natural ecosystem. A person fills their soul with culture, religion, and spiritual protections against demonic influence or mind viruses. Modernity believes in the buffered personality, or that all humans are rational, independent units which study the world objectively and then make calculated decisions from that. The modern science, as well as the folk wisdom from all of history, completely disagrees. Humans are crazy monkeys who need society and religion to hold them accountable against their own madness. This establishes a major psychological feedback loop in modern thinking, which ultimately dooms it. Since people are innately good and rational, thus the things they think also should be good and rational. This makes it physically impossible to to modernity be able to introspect on its own flaws. Carl Jung has spoken a lot about how our own internal mental worlds are reflected out into the outside world. An easy example of this is architecture, where in the same way you can see a little window into someone's soul from the interior decorations they put in their house, you can do so for the type of architecture a civilization builds with. If we are judging ourselves by our culture, our society is completely suicidal. Our society's culture unironically refuses to not put out content that believes in anything. All the art the mainstream makes looks legitimately demonic now. We've stopped having the ability to make new art, rehashing the intellectual properties of generations ago. Our buildings look completely soulless and inhuman. There's no place for the human soul anywhere in our society. This is the complication. If someone were to ask me, Rudyard, what would we need to pull our civilization back from suicide? Is it material or psychological? The short answer, as I said earlier, is yes, in that we have to make material changes to our society so we're less lonely, poor, angry, and directionless. However, I believe the first step is psychological and philosophical, given if we don't have a direction to aim towards, all the material improvements we attempt will be aimless and will fail naturally. This video is not meant to heal our entire civilization, I'm just making a start. And I have this channel, I'll be here. I'm going to keep making videos on this topic to hopefully improve it, and this is just the beginning of a series of videos. However, back to EMDR, we have a series of psychological narratives which we implicitly hold on to, but of which we're often not even aware of. For example, most people with PTSD psychologically blame themselves for trauma that occurred to them. This is since PTSD happens when something traumatic that didn't even exist inside your mental frame occurs. Thus, your body is on alert as a way of trying to guess things that you don't know, which is impossible. The way you heal PTSD is to remove the belief that you are in power of things outside your control. I can't stress enough the point that you don't know who you are. The person you believe yourself to be is a press agent for your subconscious, whose role is to make you look good to others. Psychological studies have found time and time again where our minds are terrifyingly good at even deceiving ourselves. The book The Elephant in the Brain is incredible at explaining this topic. You are really your underlying assumptions, not the press narrative that you narrate to yourself and others. Lots of people in society today actually do hate themselves, although if you were to ask them, even completely blackout drunk, they would never say so. However, if you were to watch their actions, you would consistently find that they had self-defeating behaviors which overrode the smiley exterior. I think this is vastly more people than we realize. I worry it's a majority of our current population. Every culture has a mythology, which is really the switchboard from which the society makes decisions. Modernity struggles with understanding mythology, given it's too indirect in that mythology is almost like a video game, which both tells you what the map of the world is, and also the best strategies for playing the game. For example, Western civilization has pulled from Greek and Nordic mythology alongside the Abrahamic tradition. Over Western history, people have looked back to King Arthur, Solomon, or Achilles as role models of behavior. When young men died at the Somme, they did so LARPing as Greeks fighting the Persians. Our society has completely restructured our own mythology, mostly around a combination of Marxism, Freudianism, and Hollywood. When we make decisions, we cross-reference it against those. I really can't overstate the importance of Hollywood, which is really the mythological circuit board I see Americans use the most in their value system. This is something that's so deep, I need to make a video just on it, but here's a text wall if you're interested. I've been meaning to make a video, I guess, on Californian civilization, if you want to call it that, but there's been 2 books on that topic I've been postponing reading for a while. The really key problem here is that in our current mythology, we lose by definition. The left very purposely structured our entire worldview to be a spider's web where we lose by structure no matter what we do. An example of that is that in our current social structure, if you're not successful, you're a loser, but if you are successful, you're also bad in the leftist worldview. If you're a white person and you choose to indulge in other cultures, that's racist, being cultural appropriation, and if you don't, that's also racist. If you move to a majority-minority area, that's gentrification, and if you move to a majority-white area, that's white flight. You can see here that the underlying reality is that our entire worldview was a matrix established in the last century to actively harm us. Our previous worldview, even though it was flawed, was made mostly by honest people who were compiling millennia of of wisdom to try to help others. Meanwhile, the leftist materialist worldview was also made with that intention. However, their definition of helping people was completely destroying civilization. Keep in mind the leftist authors of the mid-20th century all publicly said this stuff. They wrote strategy books saying the purpose of their entire worldview was to weaken the old established order for the revolution through a process of social alienation. Read or listen to Saul Alinsky, Yuri Bezmenov, Gramsci, or even what Marx openly said. These authors openly said that they were trying to destroy religion and community trust, often saying they wanted to have a bureaucrat so that neighbors couldn't talk to each other or friends couldn't make deals and everything had to be structured through a bureaucrat to weaken the society so the communists would win. They said that religion was their greatest enemy and they had to destroy it at all costs. We've been trapped in a spider's web where the left will win the game because they made the game. The more the right wriggles inside the leftist paradigm, the more we lose and get trapped in the web. Religions are a form of hypnotic seduction. I say this since hypnosis is an altered psychological state, which changes how you psychologically perceive the world. You can only be hypnotized if you want to be, and hypnosis therapy is pretty effective at rewiring subconscious assumptions. You can tap into underlying neurological assumptions through hypnosis. Hell, EMDR is a form of hypnosis. Certain priest classes for certain religions are hypnotic worldviews which completely change how you perceive reality itself on any level. It's almost as if religion enters your own eyes, and when you see the world, you see a different universe than someone else. This is where my idea of shattering the glass comes from. I came to realize that the left has developed a mental ecosystem where they win by their own definition. By acknowledging any of the left's underlying realities, we gradually let them hypnotize and seduce us. If you can't win a game, break the game or play a different game. The mind is a living organism, and you need to refuse to take in mental thought viruses that actively harm you. When I say shatter the glass, I mean to completely shatter the old paradigm. I think the old paradigm is wrong on a very deep level, and I wrote 12 different incorrect assumptions which we need to rewire in order for us to survive. I didn't have to be the person who did this, but as my father would say, if no one in the room is doing the right thing, that makes it your duty. To be very clear, if we can't rewire these assumptions, we are completely doomed, since our psychological ecosystem is so biased towards nihilism that any good things will be wasted. I take responsibility for this shattering. If bad things come from this, it's my fault. I did it since it had to be done. These are the 12 underlying assumptions I think we need to alter to survive. Let's go through each. Number 1, we determine reality, changed to we submit to reality. This one should be completely self-explanatory. The most basal level of reality is that you don't get to control the world. We all submit to forces vastly more powerful than us. Even the most powerful people in human history were completely powerless compared to the natural forces which constrain them. This is also the first principle which you need to understand for all the others to make sense. Without reality, there's no way to orient yourself since there's no arbitration method to deal with the world itself. In school, I had to read an article that said if we socialized women, they would be as good basketball players as men. That's insane. We constantly deny reality, whether by ignoring scarcity, genetic, or sexual differences. Our entire paradigm is the denial of reality. Trans is the easiest example. I hope you can see what the issue here is. The problem is that most people in the West somehow don't believe this. If you studied the underlying philosophic assumptions of our society, they would come across as insane. The left in postmodernism thinks that power relations determine reality. There are other varieties of this with eugenics, tech worship, and market worship. In each case, they think that innovation means humans are no longer beholden to reality. Most people in the West believe some variety of this myth, which ultimately stems from the ancient religion Gnosticism, as I explained in this text wall. Number 2, nothing is enough to everything is just what it is. I alluded to this before, but we live in the wealthiest, most secure, hygienic, one of the freest and most permissive societies ever. If we were rational, we would be infinitely grateful for this, but it's clear that's not the case. The great irony is that the best off society ever was also the most dissatisfied ever. As I said before, we're tearing our entire civilization down, committing effective suicide due to self-loathing. I'm not saying there aren't problems, but we should at least be grateful for the things our society does. This sort of attitude, first of all, promulgates nihilism, since we never feel satisfied with what what we accomplish, and thus we don't accomplish anything. This also enables the worst demographic in history, or the most envious and petty. This attitude is also just the most spoiled brat behavior imaginable. The founders of the modern Anglo-American order were some of the most humane, intelligent, enlightened people who have ever lived, and the fact that their main criticism is that they didn't go far enough is a moral sin of the highest level committed by our society. Those who make this criticism are the most entitled people who have ever lived. For example, Europe peacefully gave up on its colonial empires after World War II. This is such a stunningly generous act that it's historically unbelievable. However, the main criticism is that they didn't go further enough, which is legitimately insane. What do these people really want? If they can't answer that question, their life is just wandering through a marsh without a way out. No matter what we accomplish, we're judged by the eye of an impossible utopia. This is the cruelest thing you can do to a person, since it denies their personhood and the validity of their existence. We've gone past the intellectual point where we believe the West is at all psychologically redeemable. Our culture wants to solve this by suicide, which is the most nihilistic and evil way possible. The real answer is that things are just what they are. Everyone has space for improvement, but I don't want to crap on Eritrea for being one of the poorest countries in the world. They have their problems and we have ours. The only way to not go insane is to take and love things for where they're at. Then you're happy when they improve, since it's rare. 3. The world is dead to the world is alive. This is one of those things that people assume is an actual philosophic argument, but it's really just a matter of perspective. I just finished reading an interesting book at The Disenchantment of the World by Storm. It argues that everyone who wrote about disenchantment, or the idea that the world is a boring, controlled place without spirits or drama or magic, were people who themselves studied the occult and magic and were trying to seduce the public with their own paradigm, ironically magically. It's pretty clear the more that you see that the world is a spectacular, beautiful place. We have the Amazon rainforest, Alexander the Great, the city of Istanbul, Komodo dragons, and so many other things. American politics today is more interesting than Game of Thrones, while we've made incredibly powerful genies or AIs which give us wisdom. The world we live in is more wonderful than anything that we could possibly imagine. However, we never look at this and pretend the world is a sterile, controlled place. We're living after the end of history. This is a completely arbitrary distinction built off our addiction to power. If the world is a place capable of being controlled and mastered by us, it's dead phenomena. We neurologically completely differently respond to living and dead things. By treating the world as dead, there's nothing worth living for. The reality is the world is not dead mechanistic materia, but is an interactive system we have to actively engage with. This is why hacks for the stock market or dating system don't work long term, since the system is capable of responding to shortcuts. This is why every generation must battle against the world, since the set of our story actively changes before our own eyes, changing as we change it. History isn't even close to over. Life will always be a struggle and adventure. 4. We are soulless blank slates, changed to we all have unique souls. The founding myth of our current civilization is that all humans are interchangeable blank slates, which are completely molded by social engineering. The best example of this is trans, which exists in direct opposition to the most fundamental duality of human nature, that being the masculine and the feminine. We could briefly survive without the nation, class, or religion, but once you mess up biological sex, the human race is extinct. I talk about this theme more so in my video on the anthropology of the left, and that every assumption of our society ultimately leads back to the blank slate as a master key. It also explains why the left has declared war on human life between religion, community, sex, class, the nation, art, philosophy, and other organic living human cultures. Ending the nation through immigration is blank slate personified. This is pretty ironic given the blank slate has been disproven for for over a decade by mountains of scientific evidence and research. Even leftists in the sciences acknowledge that at least half of human behavior on a very anal level, with stuff like how fast you drive, your political affiliation, how cilantro tastes, and vacation locations, are genetic. Everyone in genetic science at this point knows there are significant genetic differences across race, sex, ethnicity, and class. The question is just how much. This is a video I made which talks about this more. This is a nuclear bomb which will completely destroy the foundations of our society once we realize it. There is freedom here in that the blank slate ultimately leads to totalitarianism, since once you think human nature is perfectible, it then becomes the responsibility or duty of the ruling class to do so. If we remove the blank slate, we remove their fodder, since giving authority to fallible human nature will obviously backfire. Number 5, everyone is equal to change to some are better than others. Most of these aren't actual arguments, but are basically faith-based claims masquerading as scientific or rational. It's impossible to prove that people are equal, since it's so obviously not true. The only way it makes sense is by taking a blank slatist argument, which we know isn't true. How is Napoleon in any way equal to the rapper Lil Xanax? The story of human history is the story of inequality, for better or for worse. Hell, capitalism's enormous success suggests that the most powerful force in human nature is the unequal pursuit for status. The idea of equality sounds nice on paper, but in reality has disastrous consequences. Something pre-industrial authors reaching back to the Greeks were very aware of. The thing the founding fathers were most worried about with the rise of the new American Republic was ideas of equality, enabling envy, and mob rule. This was since they had studied the parallels to Greco-Roman civilization earlier, where their failed democracies occurred for that reason. The founding fathers were able to predict socialism a century in advance due to said ancient parallels. What equality ultimately aims at is the tearing down of the great, since that's the easiest thing to do, rather than increasing the lows to higher levels. When you see a government championing equality, what you really see is the elite allying with the mob against the vigorous, given it's in the shared self-interest due to self-preservation for the elite and envy from the mob. This is what killed Europe as it elected socialist governments in the early 20th century, which destroyed Europe's global competitivity for the century after. Keep in mind, this was after 500 years, where Europe completely dominated the world in any single trait. This is a tale as old as time, seen, as said before, in the classical era, medieval Asia, Latin America, or with modern wokeness, as I explained in this text wall. This is not to say equality is useless. Inequality can have equally negative effects, which I explain in this text wall. Like men and women, or employers and employees, these two principles exist in critical tension where you need to enable their strengths, but not activate their weaknesses through cooperation. Latin America is an example of both elitism and communism failing, while capitalism does a good job of coordinating through consensual cooperation. Number 6, the downtrodden are morally good, changed to success and morality are completely different axes. This is an idea that stems indirectly from equality. Basically, in order to have the idea of equality to psychologically balance out, you have to make the lessers morally superior and the inferiors superior. Allying the have-nots is also just the left's evolutionary strategy to get power. What I'd say is that all of these theories immediately fall apart under pressure. An example is I feel comfortable saying America is morally superior to the Taliban, even if we have issues. Most countries in the Middle East would rather be conquered by America than the Taliban, even if the Taliban are culturally and religiously closer to them. I don't think there's much of a relationship between status and morality. I think the higher status tend to be more competent in general as an imperfect rule, since they needed competence either to achieve or maintain dominance. A lot of this is just completely dependent on context, in which certain ecosystems reward good behavior to rise in status, like democracies, while others, like police states, actively reward negative behaviors. I just want to completely remove the discussion of morality from the discussion of greatness, as Nietzsche wanted to in the 19th century. Were the Romans the good or the bad guys? That depends on who you ask, but either way, everyone can agree that the Romans were excellent and incredible. Same thing with most empires or most things. Growing up, my father would say, don't go around the world looking for good or bad guys, since there often isn't a line, line, and there's often not a good guy. Number 7, progress is innate to we make progress happen. This one is an outgrowth of the idea that we've innately mastered the world, turning it into dead phenomena which we can manipulate. This idea stems from Hegel's idea of the dialectic, which in turn stems from the stunning technological, political, social, economic advances seen in Western civilization over the last 1,000 years since the Crusades. I can see on an emotional basis why that would color someone's vision with the idea that progress is innate. We take progress so for granted that we assume a new change must be good or progress. However, this is one of those fish in a pond moments in which if you look at any other data set, this is clearly not the case. We are clearly the exception, partly due to various good luck on Europe's part culturally or geographically, as well as the West having the most advanced concept of human nature, thus creating incredibly effective institutions. If you look at every other civilization ever, you have great leader creates empire, said empire decays, and then the barbarians burn everything down, then restart ad nauseum. This is how the Chinese, Indians, native Mexicans, Arabs, Babylonians, and even the Greeks or Romans saw time as cyclical. The reality is that history is more so like a double helix, which is a very constant theme in mysticism around the world. It can appear either like a spiral or a line going up, depending on how you look. This explains all the historic narratives in which, yes, there are repeated cycles in history, while at the same time the total game does change. The thing is, the game does grow bigger and better, which is why the world is 8 times the population it did 200 years ago. As the game does get bigger and more complex, individual human lives get better in the course of a single lifetime, but get pushed back into hardship, since suffering is required for the impetus for continued progress. This suggests to me that the meaning of life, in some ways, is structured on an individual level, in which you will be offered challenges that you have to take on as an individual in your generation, and your children have to continue with free will to make the decision to either take or leave responsibility for the situation. A great irony, and this is seen in psychological studies of narcissism, is that while we suffer from tremendous self-loathing, due to our ideas of progress, we are also absurdly arrogant, given we think we're so much more vastly superior to the rest of history that we're not comparable at all. Self-loathing and arrogance are two sides of the same coin in a manner dignity and humility are. However, this is not a good combination for us. 8. Everything is material to we must accept natural law. This is again something that's basically a cyclical argument. Empiricism is the idea that we measure things that we can physically see. I would say that I'm an empiricist in most ways, even though I have several non-empirical tendencies. I try to use an empirical analysis of history and seeing what does and doesn't work, without getting stuck in theories where your own sense of the world is controlled by the theory itself. However, one of the points we don't get in empiricism is that spiritual phenomena are some kind of empirical experience. We have billions of records of people having spiritual experiences, enough that every major civilization has been built off religion. If you really study the world empirically, you find that humans have lots of conscious experiences like drama, religion, philosophy, tradition, and other things, which are ideal things that don't exist in the physical world, but matter completely. Whether a nation can fulfill the abstract moral concept of justice determines almost every part of its society. Same thing with any moral concept of how material matter must fulfill dualistic mating. The laws of the universe which reward and punish us, which you see consistently across history, and depending on how you want to frame things, you can either call the will of God or the laws of physics. The societies which follow natural law, such as maintaining freedom, honor, toughness, and inventiveness, beat those that don't. You can push this thesis to differing degrees, but it's clear the universe has abstract principles which don't exist on a material plane of existence. It's clear not all of reality is material, given through studying physics, we've consistently found that atom-to-atom movement has been incapable of predicting outcomes. And when we look at human psychology, we find religion another non-material thing is incredibly important. The pure materialist argument stems from us only looking at replicable phenomena. This is useful for law and manufacturing, but the actual human experience has too many things that aren't replicable. Emotions, religion, passion, love are things we can't leave out of our paradigm. Imagine if we could never see true love or love inside the lab unless we said it never existed. This distinction is probably the best argument for the separation of church and state. 9. There are easy answers changed to life is innately mysterious. When people ask me, Rudyard, how did the Roman Empire fall? I like to jokingly say, depends on what your agenda wants it to be. I've seen convincing arguments that the Roman Empire fell due to moral degeneracy, population decline, changes in military structure, the rise of Christianity, elite issues, civilizational life cycles, and climate change. Normally, people pick whatever their current agenda is. I'm self-aware I do this in that I blame the exact same things that are killing our society today, such as moral degeneracy and population decline. I know that I'm doing it, and yet I still do it since I don't have a better answer yet. Human nature is funny. When you look over history, you find dozens of brilliant philosophers who claim to have found revolutionary total truths. Plato, Confucius, Jesus, Muhammad, Marx, Rousseau, in that their ideas negated the ideas of other philosophers. However, were any of these figures proved really right or wrong? Of course, some ideas innately are more accurate at describing the world than others, which is why we can see by certain political philosophies working vastly better than others, but the water can get pretty murky. For example, Marx is an example of a philosopher who got things really wrong. The philosophy he developed killed downwards of 100 million people with a philosophy completely disconnected from nature. However, when he said, due to the psychological alienation of capitalism, socialism was doomed to dominate the next 200 years as a lesson in world history before something else, that was brilliant. Even the figures who we would worship like Christ or Aristotle are still controversial figures, which very smart philosophers have denounced. No deep questions about life can really be answered. We can make a narrative to explain it to us, but it's completely unclear if that narrative is actually the fundamentally correct universal narrative. We're not even clear how much of correct universal narratives there are in life. So we don't even know how to answer that question. We can just do what we have to do in this situation to get things to work. What's the purpose of life? How should we be happy? Are men or women better than the other? Why did France lose out to Britain in the 19th century? For each of these, you're wrestling with a living, dynamic idea. And you can get a pretty good answer, but there are no easy answers, only differingly imperfect ones, which we have to make trade-offs for which is better. 10. Life has no meaning to we die without meaning. Our current society completely rejects meaning. We never talk about it and basically socially outcast or reject anyone who tries to talk about it. Our elite openly champions nihilism. We never really have serious conversations about what we actually want out of life. And postmodernism is literally a philosophy built off the rejection of meaning. It hates those who have opposing grand narratives to nihilism. The irony is that we've consistently found through Sowell or studies in ancient wisdom that wealth isn't the most important thing for happiness by a long shot, and values or community are the most important variable. This means that the breakdown of both are basically dooming factors for society. They're not side dishes, but the main course. For whatever reason, we need meaning to survive. I think this is more so a male trait, but I believe is still universally human. We literally die without meaning, and the societies that lose said meaning always collapse. This is just a fundamental reality of the world, and it's completely obvious that the removal of meaning has been negative to our societies. The greatest issue I believe Gen Z fails besides loneliness is existential nihilism. When we die, the thing we think about is, did we fulfill our meaning or our relationships? Not that we got rich couch or where we went on vacation. 11, we are rationally disconnected from the world to our minds are molded by our surroundings. One of the things I find stunningly ridiculous is that for decades, our society believed that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, not stuff in the person's life. This is one of those things that's technically true in framing, but is completely ridiculous if you analyze it holistically. The thing is that the chemical imbalance is caused by your life being terrible. As we spoke about earlier, Johann Hari's book Lost Connections covers this really well. The idea that people would just magically have depression with no external environmental conditions starting it is just insane in retrospect. Alternately, the idea that you can completely separate someone from their ecosystem. Gen Z is in a worse economy, dating situation, political climate, they have crippling loneliness, meaning issues, and when they fail or get depressed, it's still their fault. They're being judged by a boomer standard to which they have nothing in common with. People are completely separated from their context, even though, in reality, context determines nearly literally everything. We do a lot of other insanities due to this idea, which Charles Taylor calls the buffered personality. In medieval philosophy, our minds were seen as living organisms you should put good bacteria into in order to protect it against mind viruses. The Catholic Church was seen as a spiritual antibody protecting against demonic possession. The world was innately seen as a psychic, spiritual ideal place, since all things had spiritual charge that you had to relate through ceremony and tradition. We can see the inverse of this attitude today, in which all mental health issues need to be solved by therapy or rationally changing your own mind. The reality is people aren't rational, and religion or community are the things which do the best job at keeping people psychologically stable. We would never think this, since we never think of the human character of society, instead seeing us as a bunch of cogs. 12. Self-loathing is a virtue. Change to self-loathing is as bad as hubris. In my opinion, this is the most cancerous and satanic thing our society does, which I can't get past. In our culture, the more you loathe yourself, the more moral a person you are. White or Western majority things which don't actively self-flagellate get torn down. The West is committing civilizational in real time. Even the most basic parts of our identity, between aesthetic, food, housing, school, and anything else, are being ripped up. There's some idea that this helps the downtrodden, but why? Making the rich hate themselves doesn't help the poor. In fact, it makes them worse off, since the rich and poor are actually dependent on the others for society to work. The rich and poor need to be good at their social station for everyone to benefit. If white America falls apart, black America will be hurt more than the whites would be. I remember growing up, I learned to tear myself down in conversations, to not aspire to things or try to realize my full potential, since in school or in the culture, any sign of ambition or dedication was treated as elitism and arrogance. Even to try to be more moral, smart, or successful is elitist in their worldview. This is a worldview which is dragging us all down to hell in real time. This nihilism is the most evil thing in history. I hold it as worse than even the bloodthirsty humanist utopianism in the last century, since even they liked growth in human life itself. What can I say about a movement that thinks having children is morally wrong and being a man makes you born into sin? Final. I hope you can see that this is exactly why we need to shatter the glass. I hope you can see how our society is being eaten alive by active evil. Once you see these things, you realize the hour is late and things are very, very urgent. When we see the issues in society today, they're the very tip of a very, very deep iceberg of social rot caused by pure nihilism. A society can't believe the things we do and succeed or be happy, or even fail honorably. These things are so cancerous we need to investigate and uproot them now. If we don't solve this now, this is only the beginning of something truly evil and dark. This level of nihilism, if allowed to percolate, will transform us into something truly evil, disgusting, and vast. Our people and our souls are at stake here. Everything we love is at stake. You could say I'm fear-mongering, but I believe all of this with complete sincerity. For the love of God and with all the power invested in me by myself, I will shatter this glass. I hope that what comes out of this, if anything, is better than what we have now. Peace.